Get ready for a deep dive into a fascinating region, a real cultural crossroads. The Swahili Coast. You've given us some great material on it, really fascinating stuff, and I'm ready to unpack it all. The history, the culture, all those forces that shaped it. It's going to be a journey.
You know, what always gets me about the Swahili Coast is how it kind of flips the script on how we see history. Like it's this proof that the world was connected even way back then. Globalism, it's not just a modern thing. You know?
Right. It really makes you think. Before we really get into it, I got to admit, my own picture of the Swahili Coast, it was, way off. I picture something much smaller.
Yeah, easy mistake. We're talking about a huge chunk of East Africa's coast here, over 1,800 miles. We're talking Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, cities like Sofala, Mombasa, Kilwa, and the islands, wow, Zanzibar, Lamu, even bits of the Comoros. It's vast.
1,800 miles and puts it in perspective. And it's not just about the geography, right? It's this incredible blend of African and Arab influences. And it's not just history. It's still very much alive today.
Absolutely. Woven into everything, the language, the buildings, the food, how society works, like a living example of how cultures mix and create something new. But to really get that, we got to rewind a bit. Before the whole global trade thing took off, what was life like back then?
Yeah, before the hustle and bustle, paint us a picture. What was everyday life for the people who lived there?
Imagine, completely tied to the land and the sea. Pastoralism, fishing, and agriculture, that was it. The land, it's fertile, good rainfall, so farming and keeping animals worked well. And the ocean, well, that was their other farm. Tons of fish and shellfish just waiting to be, dinner.
People in tune with their surroundings.
Aye.
So how did things change when the Indian Ocean trade scene blew up?
Think of the Indian Ocean as like a watery Silk Road, right?
Sure.
Connecting all these different cultures, Asia, Africa, Middle East, the works. This network, it might have even connected more people than the actual Silk Road. Can you believe that?
Okay.
And it sparked this incredible cultural exchange, not to mention the economic boom.
And the Swahili Coast, they were right in the middle of it. So what was their role in this massive maritime network? What treasures were they trading?
They were sitting on a gold mine, literally. Timber, gold, ivory, those were their top sellers. Then you got animal skins, spices like pepper and cloves, all super valuable in those far-off lands. In return, they got the good stuff. Silks and porcelain from China, those amazing spices from India, even frankincense and myrrh from Arabia. Every ship was basically a floating treasure chest, full of stories.
I can only imagine the stories those ships could tell. But those voyages, those were risky, weren't they? I mean, the Indian Ocean, it's massive.
And that's where Mother Nature stepped in, literally. The monsoon winds, those predictable wind patterns, they were the engines of the Indian Ocean trade, way more reliable and less risky than, say, those caravans on the Silk Road.
It's amazing how geography and nature just team up to change the course of history. But being in the mercy of the wind, that had to limit where they could go, right?
You got it. But people were clever. That's where the lateen sail comes in. The triangular ones you see on traditional dhows. Total game changer. See, unlike those square sails everyone else was using, lateen sails, they could catch the wind from almost any direction. Didn't matter as much which way the wind blew. Suddenly, sailors had options. They could explore new routes. It's like upgrading from a horse to a sailboat. More freedom.
It's mind-blowing how a simple sail design could change trade and cultural exchange so much.
Totally. And speaking of connections, those pieces of pottery you sent over, finding those shards on the Swahili Coast, traced back to China, archaeology at its best, really brings this whole connection thing to life,
It's like holding a piece of the past. Real proof of those trade routes, the cultural exchange. It wasn't just ideas. It was real, tangible connections across continents.
It really makes you think about all the stuff we must miss in digs,
Right.
But hey, those pottery shards are a pretty good reminder, right? The Swahili Coast, it was connected, really connected.
Makes you want to hop in a time machine. So we've got this booming trade network, cultures mixing it up. But what about the people? What was daily life actually like in Swahili society?
It was really diverse, way more than you might think. Makes sense, being a crossroads and all. You had the elite families, often the merchant families, the bigwigs. They were the tastemakers, the trendsetters. Then, of course, you had your merchants, big and small craftspeople, weavers, potters, you name it. Oh, and we can't forget the sailors and the dock workers, keeping those trade routes humming. Everyone had their role.
And then there's Islam, a huge part of Swahili culture, another layer to this whole tapestry.
Exactly. Pinning down when it first arrived, that's tricky. But there's evidence pointing to as early as the 8th century. Traders, settlers, some even escaping persecution brought it over. But here's the thing. It didn't wipe out the existing traditions. It blended with them, creating something new.
And you see that blend so clearly in their architecture. Those mosques? Wow.
Right. They're different, maybe not as grand as some you see elsewhere in the Islamic world, no towering minarets. But their beauty is in the details, the materials, the craftsmanship, coral stone, mangrove timber, simple, elegant.
It's like their beliefs and the environment are coming together in those buildings. Fascinating. What about the homes, regular people's homes? Did they have those design elements too?
Oh, you'd be surprised. They were mainly mud brick, but often with these amazing carved doors, intricate window grills, real artistry. But those details, they weren't just for show. The carved screens, they kept the air flowing in that heat, plus gave some privacy.
Form and function working together. It's like those beautifully carved Swahili chests you see in museums.
Exactly. And the designs often borrow from different cultures. Again, that melting pot thing. Speaking of which, we got to talk about the Swahili language itself.
It's like its own little history lesson, isn't it?
Totally. It's got this Bantu base, but with a good dose of Arabic sprinkled in. Linguists still go back and forth about how much each influenced the other. But one thing's for sure, that mix tells you a lot about the Arabs and the Bantu people, how closely they interacted.
It's wild how those interactions shaped not just words, but the whole language structure. And get this, the word Swahili itself, Arabic for coast, Salali, like it's summing up that whole history of cultural exchange.
You nailed it. The name says it all. And this whole idea of cultures colliding, it's even clearer when you look at two of the Swahili Coast's big hitters, Kilwa and Zanzibar.
Ah, now those are names I remember from history class. Kilwa, that was the wealthy one, right? Controlled a lot of the trade.
Oh yeah, Kilwa was the place to be. Its location was perfect, controlled all that gold trade. Picture this, in its heyday, the 14th, 15th centuries, the Kilwa Sultanate, they were huge. Their reach stretched all the way down to Sofala in modern-day Mozambique.
Wow, talk about an empire. What was life like there back then?
Think prosperity. The elite, flush with gold, they were building like crazy. Mosques, palaces, you name it. Coral stone, intricate carvings, the works. The Great Mosque of Kilwa, one of the oldest and largest in East Africa. That's 12th century. And Ibn Battuta, that Moroccan explorer, you know him.
Yeah, wasn't he a tough critic?
He came through in 1331 and was blown away by Kilwa. Called it one of the most beautiful, well-built cities in the world. High praise.
Coming from him, that's saying something. But what happened? Why the decline? Did the gold run out?
You know how it is with empires? It's never just one thing. Internal power struggles, competition, and then, of course, the Portuguese showed up in the 16th century and things changed.
The Portuguese, always shaking things up.
Right. They wanted that gold and spice trade, were dead set on controlling it all. And with their ships and firepower, Kilwa didn't stand a chance. End of an era.
It's amazing how one moment you're on top and the next, well, the world shifts. Speaking of shifting powers, Zanzibar. Spices and a fascinating history, right?
Zanzibar is a whole other story, marked by cloves and, a bit of a love-hate relationship with Oman. By the 19th century, it was the clove capital of the world. People flocked there, hoping to strike it rich. And Stone Town, UNESCO World Heritage Site now, but back then, it was the heart of it all.
It makes you think, those old cities, they've seen it all, but we've been focusing on the bright side, haven't we?
True. We can't ignore the shadows. And one of those, a big one, is the slave trade.
Yeah, that's a tough conversation, often misunderstood. What made the East African slave trade different? I mean, how did it compare to, say, the transatlantic slave trade?
Good point. When we think transatlantic, we think plantations, right? Brutal, large scale. The East African coast, it had slaves even from early on, but the scale, the reasons, totally different.
So no massive plantations like in the Americas?
Nope. Before the 18th century, it was much smaller. Many slaves, they were domestic servants, skilled labor, headed to homes mostly in the Middle East and Asia. And get this, women and children, they were in high demand.
Really different from what we usually picture with slavery.
Right. And don't forget, Islamic law was big in Swahili society. Enslaved people, they had some rights, protections. Manumission, aka freedom, was possible, and children born to slave concubines, often free, integrated into the family, not minimizing the horrors, but highlighting the complexities.
History, it's never simple, is it? It's about digging deeper, seeing the nuances.
Absolutely. And those nuances, they often reveal stories of incredible resistance, like the Zan Rebellion. It's a story for the ages, the human spirit refusing to be broken, even when everything's stacked against them.
That's a story we need to hear more about. Remind us what happened, why it was such a big deal.
The Zan Rebellion, talk about standing up for yourself. It's the 9th century, and Basra, big port city, modern-day Iraq, right at the heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. And what happens? Boom. Over 500,000 enslaved people rise up. Many of them probably taken from the East African coast.
500,000. That's incredible. What drove them to that point? What were the conditions like?
These were people living cushy lives. They were working those date palm plantations, the backbone of Basra's economy, and it was brutal. Backbreaking labor, treated horribly, you name it. They were desperate.
It's hard to even imagine what would make someone say enough after all that.
And here's the thing. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment riot, the Zan Rebellion, that was organized. Leaders, plans, a real burning desire for freedom. They fought a guerrilla war against the Abbasid Caliphate. And get this, for 14 years.
14 years against an empire. That's, did they have any victories?
They weren't messing around. They even took over Basra for a while, set up their own communities, their own rules. In that world that said they were nothing, they made their own space.
That's powerful. But what happened? How did it end?
Well, the Abbasid Caliphate, they weren't going to let that stand. They eventually came back with everything they had. The rebellion was crushed, but it cost them. The Zan Rebellion, it's a reminder, those in power, they aren't untouchable. It forced them to see what happens when you push people too far.
It makes you think about all the times it's happened throughout history, right? That fight for justice, for freedom. So we've covered a lot of ground here. What are some of the big takeaways, the things we should all remember from our deep dive into the Swahili Coast?
First off, the Swahili Coast, it's like a masterclass in how cultures can come together and create something new. It reminds us that cultures, they don't exist in a vacuum. They change, they borrow, they adapt. Look at their language, their buildings, their food. It's all a big, beautiful mix.
Exactly. Instead of focusing on what makes us different, look at all the amazing stuff we create together. The Swahili Coast, it's the perfect example.
Right. And second, forget globalization. That's old news. The Swahili Coast proves the world was connected way before that became a thing. The Indian Ocean trade, all those routes, all those people and goods and ideas flowing back and forth. Amazing.
And it wasn't just stuff. It was ideas, beliefs, all mixing together and changing things for everyone.
Exactly. But we can't just focus on the good stuff. We've got to remember the dark side, too, like the slave trade. History, it's complicated, good, bad, and everything in between.
It's about taking it all in, the good, the bad, and learning from it, using it to make things better in the present for the future.
Couldn't have said it better myself. The Swahili Coast, with all its ups and downs, it's got a lot to teach us. About ourselves, about the world, how we fit into it all.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Swahili Coast, any final thoughts for our listeners?
You know, history, it's more than just facts and figures in a dusty old book. It's people, real people, living their lives, telling their stories. And the story of the Swahili Coast, it's still being told today. It's a story about cultural exchange, about resilience, about how connected we all are. Never forget that.
Beautifully put. A great note to end on. And to our listeners, as always, thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through history. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.